My name is Esther Leonard. I am the niece and godchild of Esther McCann. The night that we learned that Esther and Jessica had perished in the fire, I remember waking up early in the morning and hearing my granny like screaming, crying, and I didn't know what had happened. She told me, I was 8 at the time, so it's not something I could process easily. And I remember everybody inconsolably just bawling, crying, like it was like something out of a film. It wasn't like real life.
I was awoke by my grandmother. So I ran down the stairs and into the living room to find my mum in tears, told by my dad that Esther had died in a fire with Jessica. It was horrifying.
I'm looking at a number of photographs here. That's the one that hit me first as I arrived. And you can see the devastation. It certainly brings a lot back, quite vivid. It's almost as if it was yesterday.
Esther, aged 30, and 18-month-old Jessica died when fire swept through their home at Butterfield Avenue, Rathfarnham. Mrs. McCann's body was found lying outside her bedroom. Firemen found Jessica still in her cot. They both died from inhaling carbon monoxide fumes.
Esther McCann was 30 years old, married to husband Frank, and loved by her entire family.
Esther was a wonderful godmother. She was always very attentive to me. She made me feel really special. She just brought a light into the family that was so unusual. We would have seen Esther and Jessica on a daily basis. If we were not in Butterfield in her house, she was with us. Esther was the youngest of 4 in her family. They're from Tramore in County Waterford. She was an artist, a wonderful aunt, and just exuded life and happiness and joy, and she was just a wonderful person to be around and a wonderful person to know.
My name is Thomas O'Brien. I'm Esther's eldest nephew. Esther was real happy-go-lucky, jovial, loving, caring person. Nothing ever fazed her, nothing bothered her. Always had a good bounce in her step. She was always good crack to be around. And she'd help anyone.
In September 1992, Pat Treacy was serving as a police detective in An Garda Síochána.
I was a detective Garda in Tala. I came in to hear that 2 people had lost their lives in a fire in Rathfarnham. A devastating fire.
My name is Michael Campbell. I'm a retired detective inspector. I was attached to the mapping section in the Garda Technical Bureau. Anything involving a deceased child, that's not taken away from the death of the lady involved as well, but the fact that a child was killed in this instance, it did touch the heartstrings. This photograph I took it is where the child was sleeping that night before the horrendous event took place. And we can see cuddly toys, some child's playthings, and feeding bottles.
Pat and Michael were assigned to investigate the cause of the fire that killed Esther and Jessica.
The house was extensively damaged. We had to pick our way going in and going out of the house. We'd enter from the rear. I had worked on the Stardust where 48 people lost their lives. Devastating fire. This was another one. There was an intense fire, more intense than the normal.
Initial investigations revealed an apparently obvious explanation for the fire.
There was a number of gas leaks reported to the gas board. I read statements that an engineer had made.
The gas company had been called before. There were some problems with the gas and leaking gas. There were certainly, I think, 2 at least before the fire.
My name is Frank McCann. In 1992, when all this was happening, I was a freelance journalist. During the month of July 1992, there were 4 separate leaks reported at the McCann house. First one was, I think, on the 3rd. It was investigated. There was no actual leak found on that occasion. Second one was the 16th. There was a major leak found then and a major presence of gas that was investigated and dealt with. The third one was the 26th, and in that case, the fitters found nothing.
Days later, there was a 4th, even more serious gas leak. Frank McCann was out at work when Esther's quick thinking averted a likely catastrophe.
Esther woke up when the house was full of gas. She got Jessica, brought her down, and had she flicked the switch, the whole house could have been blown apart.
Esther pushed her car out of the driveway because she knew if she had turned on that ignition, it could have set off a fire and killed the both of them. So she pushed her own car with Jessica into the street and then drove straight to our house.
Now it seemed a gas leak might have killed Esther, just as she began an exciting new stage of her life with Frank. The couple were adopting his niece, baby Jessica.
Frank McCann had a younger sister who got pregnant when she was about 18 or 19. I think it caused some hassle within the family, so she came to live with Frank and Esther and almost immediately wanted Esther and Frank to adopt Jessica.
Esther was the most wonderful mother to Jessica. She doted on her and was so proud of her, like so proud of her. They were inseparable. They were so perfect together.
Well, you'd never think of one without the other. Esther was around us all our life. Jessica was only around a year and a half. But you couldn't see past Esther without Jessica. She was a funny little character. And they were just happy-go-lucky and they were made for each other.
Now their life together had been cut short by a fire apparently connected to a gas leak. But what had caused the leak itself? Detective Pat Treacy needed to find out.
We had to keep an open mind as to what it could have been accidental. You know, we had to investigate thoroughly.
Martin Walker, Superintendent, Kildare South. In September 1992, I was a guard and I was stationed in the small village of Blessington in County Wicklow, and I'd been there for a number of years.
Frank McCann owned and ran his own pub, the Cooperage, in Blessington.
I remember the 13th of August in 1992. It was about 7:30 p.m. I was station orderly, and Frank McCann arrived at the station window and he knocked. And he made a report that he'd received 3 anonymous telephone calls of a threatening nature, 2 at the pub in Blessington. And 3 callers essentially suggested to him that he better have the pub well insured, and stopped the conversation thereafter. On the 25th of August then, he called once again into the Garda station, and he indicated that he'd received another threatening phone call in which the caller suggested to him that he knew he'd called up to the lads up the road, i.e. the Gardaí, and that he and that fucker across the road better be careful from now on.
The threats against Frank McCann continued right up to the day before the fatal fire.
I remember the 3rd of September 1992, Frank McCann pointed out 2 telephone numbers that had been identified and circled in red in the local telephone directory. One related to the Cooperage, and it had the words "burn" written in red after it. That same day, we found the words "burn you bastard" written in paint on the rear of the public house.
Frank McCann had been receiving threats at the pub and at his house and to his phone. His wife and child were burnt in a fire and somebody had done this to him. So we had to investigate and there was a certain urgency to it.
Frank McCann was not alone. In the same phone book was a threat against another Blessington publican.
On another page then you had the West Wicklow house. It had been circled in red and bastard written after that. In order to progress our local investigations, we interviewed the publican and he confirmed that he had received 2 threatening phone calls also. It was very unusual. We'd had nothing like that ever before in Blessington in relation to any of the public houses.
We invited Frank in 3 days after the fire and we documented all the threats that he had received. He was there quite a number of hours. He was a grieving husband and we had to let him compose himself and continue on then with the statement. You know, he would have broken down a few times now.
The threats against Frank McCann cast new light on the investigation, and Police Detective Michael Campbell of the Garda Technical Bureau was now brought in.
I would have been at a number of house fires, but generally speaking, the section wasn't really required to go to a fire unless there was something turning out to be suspicious. It was cordoned off. I had a cursory look inside the cordon, into the front garden of the house. There was a fair amount of fire debris which had been thrown out from the house by the fire service, making sure that the place was as clear as possible and as safe as possible for the technical team to see what was possibly the cause of the fire. There was significant damage throughout the house. As you go through the house, it was mainly the scorching and the smoke damage. Coverings are peeling off the wall. It's inferno type. Now, the stairwell, the level of damage there was horrendous. You can see the intense burning on the walls and on the newel posts and balustrade. I was led to believe that this was more than likely the seat of the fire. The gable wall, that wall had been scorched almost white. There was very severe burning in that area. That was something of interest, well, certainly was of interest to the ballistics person.
It was their belief that a payload had been added to the fire. A payload, by that I mean an accelerant. The fire was so intense and the heat was so intense that it wasn't the result of a normal fire.
The forensic team searched for evidence of a possible accelerant and found a clue amid the burnt wreckage.
It was very early to say, but there was some suggestion of small gas cylinders that were found in the debris outside of the house, that they may have played a part in it.
We would have liaised with forensic people and they would have been of the belief that it was arson rather than an accidental fire.
Meanwhile, even after the fire, the threats against Frank McCann continued.
Whoever is waging this appalling vendetta against the McCanns is not content with, the murder of his wife and child, because Frank is staying at the house of a friend and he gets a mass card from somebody signed the Reverend Byrne, a bad, not to mention sinister joke in the circumstances. And Frank is seemingly so upset by this that he collapses.
But some of Frank McCann's behaviour was harder to explain.
On the day of the funeral, we were going to Tramore for the Mass. We stopped halfway. in Leyland Bridge for a bite to eat. We went in and had a sandwich and a drink. But outside you could see Frank walking around the hearse, talking to the car, talking away to himself. You know, which I felt then was strange, and still today I feel was strange.
There was more bizarre behaviour later that day as the funeral cortege passed a group of school children.
We were coming from the church, heading up to a relation of ours' house. McCann was shouting out the passenger window of the car that he was free and he was available to these young schoolgirls. You know. This was when he just buried his wife and his daughter. So he had a sick, twisted sense of humour, that man.
A third incident the same day left the family asking questions about his state of mind.
That evening, rather than staying around for more with the rest of the family, he made his way back to the pub that he owned because he was throwing his mother a 60th birthday and had arranged to have a birthday cake, which was a very, very strange thing to do.
His mother didn't want the party, but Frank insisted it had gone ahead. It was organised, and he didn't see a reason why he shouldn't be at his mother's party after just burying his wife and daughter.
Days later, Frank invited Esther's sister to visit the burnt-out home where Esther and Jessica had died.
He rang my mum and said that the house had been released back to him from the guards. And we went in and walked around the house, badly burned around the hall, up the stairs, up onto the landing, into Esther's bedroom, into Jessica's bedroom. The shape of Jessica was still on the blanket in her cot. Her dowry was there, her bottle. The rest of the bed was all black, bar where she had lay. You could see her shape. Down the stairs and into the living room, and that was when he said to my mum he was thinking of putting an ad in the paper for some charcoal for sale, which nobody found amusing, bar himself.
Within a week or two after that, he went on holidays to America. So I imagine for the Gardaí, it must have all seemed like very odd behaviour and not typical of a man grieving after his wife and daughter had been killed in a house fire.
Frank McCann was well known to police in Blessington, but not because he had a criminal record.
Frank McCann was the owner and operated the Cooperage pub, which is on the main street in Blessington. Myself and some of our colleagues, we used to go in there for our lunch and have an occasional pint as well. And we got to know Frank. Wouldn't have socialised with him, but did get to know him fairly well. Frank was an outsider. He came down and he ran a successful business in the pub. Well liked, I would suggest, and well accepted into the local society.
Frank and Esther married in 1987. They set up home in Rathfarnham in suburban South Dublin.
Frank was consistent. Frank was solid. He was a businessman. He seemed like he had his world put together and he had respect in the community. You know, he was involved in Ternier swimming. He was a bit bland. He's not someone that you would ever have thought that Esther would have gone for, but he was solid, and I guess that's what she needed at the time when she wanted to start a family.
By 1992, Frank and Esther were close to having the family they wanted because they had applied to adopt baby Jessica. Now Esther was anxious to get the paperwork completed.
Esther was determined to make the adoption final and legal. She wanted everything about Jessica to be legitimate and that there was no question that she was Jessica's mother.
She just idolised the child, and the child just took over her whole life, and it was, and not in a bad way or in a hard way. She was well able for her, and everything was around Jessica. Esther would have been very strong on her family values, and She would have wanted her to be Jessica McCann, or to have her own identity.
But Esther was frustrated by unexplained delays in the adoption process.
I think Jessica was just only a few months old when they put the process into the works. And from the very beginning, they were met with resistance. But Esther never really had an idea of what the problem was or why the adoption was running into trouble.
When things weren't going right with the adoption board, she couldn't understand why every box seemed to have been checked.
I knew there was an issue or a problem, that the adoption hadn't come through, but I didn't understand as to why. I thought maybe because Frank worked unsociable hours in a pub and that he wasn't home and wasn't able to do things that he should be able to do.
The delays continued, yet Esther was offered no explanation why.
I imagine Esther was completely consumed by the fact that that adoption case was being held up and not having the full details of why it was, not going through. And meanwhile, bringing Jessica up as their own and being completely crazy about her. That must have been a very, very difficult thing to live with.
Detectives now looked closely at Frank McCann, a champion swimmer, who held a senior role in the Irish Amateur Swimming Association, and he had his eye on the top job.
He was due to be made president of the Swimming Association, and there was Olympics coming up, and this was all in the pipeline.
McCann obviously was a person of some public profile. He was a big name in swimming, first as a swimming competitor, champion swimmer, and then as a swimming administrator, vice president of the Irish Amateur Swimming Association, so he would have been well known.
McCann had a reputation for turning young swimmers into champions, but shared the credit with two colleagues.
There were a lot of high hopes for the upcoming Olympics for our young Irish swimmers, a lot of whom, had been involved with the association since they were quite young. And between them, George Gibney, Derry O'Rourke and Frank McCann had trained a lot of champions. And he would have been, right there in the centre of it all.
At the time of the fire, George Gibney and Derry O'Rourke were at the centre of a paedophile sex scandal involving their swimming students. But it had taken 10 years to come to light.
It's believed that there were complaints being made to the association. And as it so happened, that it was Frank McCann who was dealing with them, and he was either ignoring them or explaining them away, so they never went anywhere.
Both Gibney and O'Rourke were close associates of Frank McCann.
They were regular visitors to their home in Rathfarnham, so he would have been very connected to them, and when they would come into the house, they would sit in the kitchen, the three of them around the table, drinking tea. And if Esther had any cause or reason to go into the kitchen, they'd just fall silent, they'd just stop talking.
Derry O'Rourke was later convicted on 29 charges of sexual abuse against minors and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The Supreme Court later quashed 27 similar charges against George Gibney.
He was charged last year, but an order from the High Court prevented him from standing trial on the basis that the alleged offences had taken place too long ago to ensure a fair trial for Mr. Gibney.
Detectives now discovered Frank McCann was also attempting to contain a scandal. It involved one of his swimming students.
We had somebody of a high rank liaising with the adoption board, and they were limited in what they could divulge. That there had been an objection to the adoption of baby Jessica by the mother of an individual whom it was contended was a student of Frank's.
It became apparent that Mr. McCann had had a child with a 17-year-old girl, and a complaint to that effect had been lodged with the adoption board.
The young girl that he got pregnant, who was 17 when she gave birth, was someone that he had been training. The baby had been born in and around the same time as Frank McCann and Esther were married. So that baby would have been about 5 years old.
The adoption board now has this complaint. They put it to Frank McCann. He denies the complaint. Esther doesn't know at this stage that this is the cause of the problem. She only knows that there is a problem, and it proceeds from there.
The formal adoption of Jessica had stagnated to some degree, and Esther was concerned about this aspect of it and was going to address the issue directly with Frank on the night, I think, of the murder.
Police now re-examined events on the night Esther and Jessica died.
Esther comes home about 10 o'clock. Frank comes home for about an hour between 10 and 11. So at 11, Frank heads back to the pub.
Sometime after 1 a.m, with Esther and Jessica asleep upstairs, a fire broke out in the kitchen.
There was a crash of glass and a sudden flash of flame from the house. Some people coming home from a wedding saw the fire burst out, very intense fire, and raised the alarm.
Fire crews raced to the scene. About 1:30 a.m, Frank McCann arrived. He seemed determined to save his wife and child from the flames.
Witnesses spoke about how Frank McCann reacted, how distraught he was, about how he almost tried to climb the ladder and had to be held back by firemen from trying to get into the house. You know, there was a lot of screaming and upset.
Detectives already suspected the fire was caused by arson. Now further investigation revealed the gas leaks were also caused deliberately.
It became apparent that the gas pipes that were in the little utility room of the kitchen had been tampered with.
When they investigated, they found damage to gas pipes that could only have been caused by the application of intense heat at some point, in other words, by something like a blowtorch.
An engineer had sealed an opening or gas leak, and so it couldn't open again. He put an extra seal on. During one of the subsequent gas leaks, it transpired that this was parted. It suggested that a blowtorch had been used purposely and trained on this seal and had broken the seal and had been prized apart. Frank McCann was a cooper by trade. He worked in Guinness's. He would have been working with barrels, using blow torches, sealing barrels, replacing damaged pieces of barrels and what have you. He would have served his time and became a qualified cooper, so much so that he opened a pub in Blessington and he called it the Cooperage.
A series of gas leaks. Frank McCann's expertise with a blowtorch, and his secret child with a teenage student. The investigation now had a clear focus.
If what we were uncovering appeared to be true, it was a dreadful scenario. Somebody has it in for Esther, you know, and it was pointing to one person.
But the threats against Frank McCann's life remained unexplained.
We canvassed Mr. McCann. Had he any idea, any rationale or reasons to why this crime had been committed and he'd been threatened in this way? Did he owe anyone money, or had he had a row or anything like that? Usual run-of-the-mill type of inquiries that would be the commencement of something like this.
He was contending that there was some organisation that he was under threat, and, you know, we had to tread warily as well, you know, but inquiries revealed that this was not so.
There was an effort made to trace the telephone calls to his house and to the two pubs in particular. We were satisfied that, yes, it would appear that telephone calls were received, but we could never establish the genesis of them, who made them or why.
Various people would have been approached in Blessington and in Rathfarnham and around the city. You know, we would have had people with contacts in various organisations or illegal organisations, and These would have been approached and everything was coming back negative. You know, that there was no substance to these allegations of threats.
Police concluded that far from being the victim of threats, Frank McCann was the source of them.
He'd done the groundwork in Blessington then to cast doubt on any suggestion that he was the actual murderer. He was preparing a defence for himself.
As time was passing and more information was coming in by way of statements and little bits of information, it was decided we have a suspect.
With Frank McCann under suspicion, a series of earlier events were now cast in a sinister new light.
I think the most striking thing is the number of times he tried to kill them was just, you know, extraordinary.
There was a documentation about the electric blanket which had been left on the seat on the back of a chair, and it was found on the bed and it was on fire.
Esther wakes up to find a folded electric blanket at the foot of her bed on fire, and she hadn't plugged it in. She couldn't explain this.
You know, something that sounded almost laughable was that her brake fluid cable had been cut. And then, I suppose the biggest one was that gas pipes had been tampered with in the house.
It all added up afterwards when you put all the bits and pieces together. But unfortunately, at the time, leading up to it, we didn't see it. Everything was calculated, devious. He just thought he was in control and he was going to deal with it the way he had to keep himself squeaky clean.
He'd planned for this and he'd tried to carry it into effect on previous dates. He was determined in his effort to kill his wife and baby Jessica, and that was obvious. On a human aspect, it was very, very much an eye-opener to think that a father could do that to a child, to his wife. It was almost inconceivable.
Police believe Frank McCann set a house fire to kill his wife Esther and foster daughter Jessica. They suspected his motive was to conceal the fact he had a child with a 17-year-old swimming student.
He didn't want his career or his good name destroyed. It was an unusual way of protecting himself and his own good character by murdering his wife and child.
He talked about cleaning up a mess that he'd made, but the cleaning up of the mess that he'd made involved eliminating other people. And just the idea that he was doing this to preserve a facade of respectability that he clearly didn't own in the first place, that was the shocking thing, I think.
Detectives now needed to prove Frank McCann had the opportunity to commit the murder and studied his movements on the night of the fire.
At 11 p.m. that night, Frank heads back to the pub. The barman of the pub says that he is there until 1 a.m. when he leaves. The local chip shop owner had meantime said that McCann had been in between 12:30 and 12:40 for a bag of chips and then left. And then another neighbour reported that the gate behind the pub had been heard creaking at 1 a.m. and she presumed that that was Frank.
The starting timescale for Mr. McCann's journey home from Blessington would have been near enough established with the closing of that gate.
Witnesses saw McCann arrive on the scene at 1:30 a.m, half an hour after leaving Blessington. Police needed to prove that was enough time for McCann to make the journey, start the fire, leave the scene, and then return, as if arriving for the first time.
Well, of course, part of my job, apart from surveying the actual scene itself, was to prepare other maps. I was tasked with driving the route along with a member of the investigation team from Blessington to Butterfield Avenue. drove in the N81 and in towards Tala and on up towards Butterfield. And I calculated the distance of that being 14.5 miles. We drove it twice at normal speed and a little bit maybe over normal. We might have gone over the speed limit once or twice.
Driving from Blessington to Rathfarnham after pub closing time, 1 a.m., no more than 20-25 minutes at the most.
My understanding with the investigation team was that this timing was crucial to support their view that Mr. McCann had time to get to the scene, set the fire, get away from the scene, and appear to arrive again a short time after where the fire was in full furnace.
Police could now show McCann had time to start the fire, that he had the means, and that he had a motive.
We had established beyond refute that there was reasonable grounds to arrest him.
In November 1992, 2 months after the deaths of Esther and baby Jessica, Frank McCann was charged with starting the fire, but he had made a further, unexpected confession.
He was arrested under Section 30 of the Offences Against the State Act in relation to criminal damage by arson, and he was detained then for a period of time, 24, and then an extension of another 24 hours. However, the official detention time expired, and Mr. McCann, I understand, returned electively to continue the interview, and during the course of this period, he made admissions of murder.
In his statement, Frank McCann described how he hugged baby Jessica, drove to Blessington to close up the pub, then returned to Rathfarnham and started the fire that killed Jessica and his wife, Esther.
Gardaí spoke about how he went into kind of a trance-like state and kind of spoke as if he was there at the time, talked them through everything that had happened.
With his full confession now on record, McCann was charged with arson and double murder. His trial began on the 11th of January 1994, but 2 weeks later came to a dramatic halt.
Today, on the 14th day of the trial, the judge dismissed the jury. McCann wasn't in court when his trial resumed today. He's in hospital recovering from burns after trying to set fire to himself in Arbor Hill Prison last weekend. It's understood that he poured deodorant over his head and then put a match to it.
The question now was whether Frank McCann was legally insane or deliberately attempting to undermine his own trial.
Today, Mr. Justice O'Hanlon told the jury there was a question whether McCann was fit to plead to the murder charges. The case was adjourned until March the 23rd for a jury to decide whether or not he's capable of facing trial.
The court ruled that Frank McCann was fit to face trial for murder, but it was 2 years before he was back in court.
So it was a very protracted, long, agonising time for, I imagine, both the McCann family and for Esther's family as well.
But as the trial at last drew near, preparations were far from straightforward.
Everything with that man was control. And here he was again, trying to control the trial, justice being served.
He had his legal team just running in circles. He had every trick in the book. He knew what he was doing. He knew he could drag this out. And I kind of think he knew he could almost be a celebrity from this trial.
Key to the prosecution case was Frank McCann's confession to murder, but defence lawyers argued the statement should be inadmissible as evidence. They said McCann had been held by police beyond the legal time limit. Detectives claimed otherwise.
It's my understanding that during the statement of admission, the period of time expired and Frank voluntarily came back in to complete the statement of admission.
If the trial judge accepted the defence argument, Frank McCann could walk free from court.
We would have had problems trying to prove the case without the statement of admission.
The judge accepted the confession was given voluntarily and could be admitted as evidence. But McCann still pleaded not guilty, meaning police would have to prove every detail of their case.
The second trial started in June 1996 and it went on for 10 weeks.
The second one was a marathon. I think it ran for 48 days in court, which of actual court time, which is unusually long. I think it was one of the longest cases in history.
Detectives needed to show the fire was caused not just by leaking gas, but that an accelerant was added to intensify the blaze. They commissioned a demonstration by experts in fire scene analysis.
We conducted this experiment in Abington in England with a forensic specialist to recreate the fire in Butterfield Avenue. There was people from the defence and the prosecution there, and we were there for about maybe a week. We were trying to establish that accelerant had been used, and we had videos, and we showed that to the jury during the trial to show that accelerant must be used in this fire to generate the heat.
Young Irish Times journalist Frank McNally spent days in the packed courtroom.
This might well have been the first murder case that I was sent to, and probably the first time that I saw a big case like this involving a huge, long-running investigation and hundreds of witnesses coming to a conclusion, so it was a dramatic thing.
McCann was depicted by his lawyers as a mild-mannered man who would never hurt his family, and onlookers were struck by his calm demeanour.
He was pretty impassive throughout the trial, sat very calmly. On the actual day before the jury went out, I think at one point he was sitting reading a crime novel, and that would have been typical he would be reading if he was not actually talking to his lawyers. But very calm, and because of the glass, slightly austere, long, tall, thin, nerdish looking. There was nothing about him that fitted the notoriety that he earned via this case.
After 48 days in court, the jury retired to consider its verdict.
The jury system, it's a very old thing in a way. It's kind of a medieval thing that if you commit some terrible crime, you are judged by a jury of your peers. It's such a responsibility, people take it very seriously. It's not something they want to get over with in an hour so they can get back to their lives. They do tend to take it very seriously.
It's a tense time, and false dawns, and juries are brought back and they want to hear more and what have you, and you're reassembled and out again.
Any verdict had to be unanimous, but the depiction of Frank McCann as an affectionate father had divided the jury. After hours of deliberation, they returned to seek guidance from the judge.
It seems that some members of the jury were troubled by a piece of his original confession where he said that on the night of the fire, beforehand he had picked up baby Jessica and cuddled her and then put her back down to sleep.
Could a man who showed such affection to baby Jessica really have killed her just hours later?
That had sowed some doubt in some members of the jury, clearly, and we think that was why they were struggling with unanimity. That was at 6:15 on Thursday. They went away again. We all settled down thinking it could be several more hours, and instead they came back suddenly 10, 20 minutes later.
The verdict came through that he was guilty.
As the family of the late Mrs. Esther McCann and baby Jessica wept at the back of the courtroom, the judge refused McCann leave to appeal.
It take a long time to get over it, but really, it's the end of one chapter. Now we can begin to grieve for Esther and Jessica. They won't be coming back.
My family were so relieved that the trial was finished that most of the adults in my family kind of really broke down that day in tears of exhaustion and just relief.
McCann of Butterfield Avenue, Rathfarnham, was found guilty on 2 charges of murder. Guilty of murdering his wife Esther, and guilty too of murdering 18-month-old baby Jessica. Tonight, Frank McCann is beginning his life sentence in Mountjoy Jail, ending the second longest murder trial in the history of the state.
After 4 years, justice was finally served, but the family's sense of loss is never ending.
I've lost an aunt. I've lost my cousin.
Frank McCann was a control freak. He wanted everything to go his way, to go according to Frank's plan. He was the centre of everything. It was the Frank McCann show and nothing else. My aunt and Jessica were just little side characters in his story.
It's not something that'll ever go away, unfortunately. It's like it happened last week. There's no turning the page or closing the book. It's as if it's... every time you see or hear of it, it opens it all up again. It doesn't go away.
McCann received 2 life sentences to run concurrently.
That kind of life sentence generally would last about 20 years. He's obviously been in longer than that, but he'll be out. And you would have to wonder, you know, how fair has it been that he has really only served the length of 1 life sentence?
If anything, it probably makes it harder to live with it, to know that he can still live his life. He's deprived them both of their lives, and he can still carry on as normal.
Certainly it stood out that this man was terribly ruthless, and forgiveness, I cannot see how it could be given.
He's an evil, twisted, calculated person. No remorse, no nothing. Never ever apologised.
After 30 years in prison, in December 2024, Frank McCann was denied parole. Esther and her family remain convinced he should be kept behind bars.
I feel like it is very important for me as Esther's goddaughter and as Esther's niece and as Jessica's cousin that I continue to fight for justice for them. And also, I can't imagine how dangerous the world would be with Frank McCann walking the streets. And I just dread that becoming a reality. There is no one in the world who can convince me that my family will be safe if he gets out.